The air on the observation deck of the Warsphere Krothar was thick with the smells of damp earth, ozone, and unidentifiable musk, a primal cocktail that Porver Daltiel, water-cased attaché to the Krothar kindred, had long ago learned to tolerate. For 10 standard Tausir, he had served aboard this living vessel, a testament to the successful integration of the Kroot into the grander vision of the Tauva. He watched the star charts shimmer on his data slate, tracing the patrol routes his presence here helped coordinate. Below him, on the main rotunda floor, hundreds of Kroot warriors were engaged in their usual rituals, sharpening quills, consuming rations of processed biomass, and sparring in dusty pits. It was a scene of controlled, purposeful savagery, a force harnessed for the greater good. Then the stillness came. It was not a silence. The warsphere still hummed with the thrum of its strange organic engines. The warriors still breathed, but all movement ceased. A Kroot warrior, mid-swing with a honed blade, froze, its wiry muscles locked. Another, halfway through swallowing a goblet of food, simply stopped, its beak agape. Across the vast cavern, every single Kroot became a statue. Porvertal felt a cold knot of dread form in his gut. He had seen Kroot enter battle trances, but this was different. This was absolute. It was as if their very souls had been disconnected from their bodies. He tapped the comms unit on his wrist. Krothar Command, this is Attaché-Tal. Report. I am observing a species-wide catalepsy. Is this a drill? Only static answered. He tried again, hailing the Tau liaison vessel, the Stalwart Reason, holding station 1,000 kilometers off the Warsphere's pitted hull. Stalwart Reason? Do you copy? I have a biological anomaly aboard the Krothar. The reply was clipped, panicked. We copy Attaché. It is not isolated to your position. We are receiving reports from across the Septe, Farsight enclaves, Sei-Chie, even the capital. Every Kroot in the Empire has ceased all activity. They just stopped. The stillness lasted for precisely 83 minutes. Then, as one, every Kroot on the rotunda moved. It was not the slow awakening of a sleeper, but the sudden activation of a machine. Their heads snapped upwards, their black, beady eyes, which had been dull and vacant, now blazed with an internal emerald light. A low hum began to emanate from their throats, a sound deeper and more resonant than their usual guttural clicks and calls. It was a chant, a psychic thrum that vibrated through the very deck plates beneath Tile's feet. He saw the kindred's shaper, a gnarled creature named Knark, with quills that had turned gray with age, step onto a raised platform. The shaper did not speak. He simply spread his arms, and the glowing light in his eyes intensified, a beacon in the gloom. Panic gave way to professional duty. TL activated his slate's recorder, documenting the phenomenon. The chanting grew, a chorus of thousands from this warsphere alone, echoed by millions from the other vessels in their flotilla. It was a summoning, a call to arms that resonated not through the air, but through some deeper, more fundamental medium. The Kroot began to move, but not back to their previous tasks. They moved with a chilling, unified purpose, securing weapons, checking the seals on their primitive void suits, and marching in disciplined columns towards the Warsphere's embarkation bays. There was no chaos, no discussion. It was the movement of a tide, inevitable and absolute. TL scrambled down the gangway, pushing through the river of green-skinned bodies. Shaper Knark, he called out, his translator unit turning his Tau speech into the clicks of the Kroot dialect. What is the meaning of this? You are deviating from your patrol vectors. By the authority of the Ethereal Council, I demand an explanation. The ancient shaper turned, his glowing eyes fixing on the Tio. Diplomat. The look was not one of malice or of anger. It was one of profound, dismissive pity. The authority of your council is a whisper in a forgotten wind, little fish. Knark's voice rasped, the translator barely keeping up with the archaic Kroot phrasing. Our pact is unbound. The debt is paid. Your greater good is a small pond, and our thirst is for the ocean. Before TL could reply, a colossal shudder ran through the warsphere. The external view on a nearby screen flickered, showing the Stalwart Reason desperately hailing them. But the Kroot ignored it. Their own engines were igniting, strange bioluminescent portals opening on the ship's exterior, pulsing with energies the Tau did not understand. Tile watched in horror as war spheres across the star system did the same. This was not a mutiny, it was an exodus. An entire species was on the move. Where are you going? Tail demanded, his voice trembling. What is this madness? Knark tilted his head, a gesture of avian curiosity. Not madness, destiny. The Shaper oracles have spoken as one. The Master Shaper, the great Encore Proc, has shown us the way. For generations, we have eaten the flesh of the strong to guide our path. We have consumed orcs for resilience, humans for cunning, and even your own kind for your curious optimism. Each meal was a step. Now, the final meal has presented itself. The Shaper gestured with a three-fingered hand towards the view screen, which now showed the star charts shifting, coalescing on a single, distant point deep within the galactic core, a region scarred by the Imperium's recent wars. A power has been born from the Great Screaming, a new star in the other sea, a god of endings, of silence, of peace, a infant god, ripe for the harvest. The full, horrifying realization crashed down on Tael. The Great Hunt. It was a legend among the Kroot, a mythical time when their entire race would unite to hunt a single worthy prey to elevate them all. He had thought it a quaint piece of folklore. He was wrong. You cannot be serious, Tael whispered. To hunt a god? To consume a creature of the warp? That is a path to damnation, to corruption. Knark let out a dry, rasping chuckle. Your kind sees corruption. We see evolution. We will devour its flesh of sorrow and its bones of despair. We will inherit its stillborn divinity. We will become the final shape. This is the great hunt. Trillions of hunters, one prey. Everything else in the galaxy is now either an obstacle or it is meat for the journey. His glowing eyes stared directly into Tael's, and the diplomat understood the unspoken threat. The alliance was over. The pacts were broken. His diplomatic immunity was now nothing more than a suggestion of his flavor. The war sphere lurched again, its engines propelling it into the void, away from the Tau system it had guarded for a century. It joined a growing fleet, a torrent of organic, brutal vessels that was multiplying by the hour, all across the Tao Empire and beyond. From every corner of the galaxy where Kroot had settled, the call had been answered. The Great Unbinding was complete. The most ambitious act of predation in galactic history had begun. Lord Admiral Valerius Corvo stood upon the observation spire of the Fist of Piety, a vantage point of armored crystal that overlooked the colossal prow of his Gloriana-class flagship. Below him, the ship's forward batteries, cannons whose barrels were wider than hab blocks, sat in silent repose, potent symbols of the Imperium's might. For 3 centuries, Corvo had commanded elements of Battlefleet Hydrafer, and his certainty was as unshakable as the adamantium spine of his vessel. He had broken Orc WAAAGHs across the spinward marches and held the line against the Night Lord's terror fleets. The reports trickling in from the Segmentum's periphery were, to his seasoned mind, little more than an annoyance. 3 more Agri colonies in the Phasian Belt have gone dark, my lord, announced Fleet Master Gannicus, his face a grim mask reflected in the crystal. No distress calls, no wreckage, just silence. Vox traffic from the system's orbital station ceased mid-sentence. Corvo did not turn. His gaze remained fixed on the star-strewn abyss. Pirates grow bold when a sector is at peace for too long, Gannicus. They mistake stillness for weakness. Send the 4th Destroyer Squadron. Have them make an example of whatever petty raiders they find. I want the wreckage of their flagship hung in orbit of Hydrafer as a reminder. But the reports that followed were not of pirates. They were stranger, more disturbing. An explorator fleet charting gaseous anomalies in the Neri deeps sent a single garbled pick capture before it vanished. The image was of something vast and spherical, a mottled green and brown object that looked less like a ship and more like a cancerous moon, crawling with thousands of spindly figures. Then came the frantic astropathic shrieks from the missionary world of St. Valerius's Hope. It was not a plea for aid against an invader, but a chorus of terror, a psychic scream that spoke of a moving famine and a sky full of hungry mouths. Then, like the others, silence. The Lord Admiral could ignore it no longer. On the grand strategium table of the Fist of Piety, the Phasian Belt was now a spreading stain of dead worlds. He had assembled Battle Group Praetorian, a fist of 20 capital ships, including 3 Emperor-class battleships and 50 escort-class vessels. It was a fleet capable of pacifying an entire subsector rebellion. It was, he felt with a surge of righteous pride, magnificent overkill for a pack of upstart Xenos. Our scouts have a confirmed sighting. Gannicus reported, his voice tight with anticipation. The Xenos fleet is converging on the Vespedia system. They appear to be harvesting the upper atmospheric layers of the primary gas giant. Long-range augurs are inconclusive. The returns are organic, nonsensical. Organics, corvospat, the word and epithet, filth. They will be scoured clean by holy plasma. Bring the battle group to full alert. We will engage them in the name of the God Emperor and remind this vermin of the price of trespassing in his domain. The transition from the warp was a gut-wrenching lurch, a tear in reality that vomited Battle Group Praetorian into the cold light of the Vespedia star. Before them, hanging against the swirling iridescent bands of the gas giant, was the Kroot fleet. It was a sight that defied all logic of naval warfare. There were no formations, no battle lines. It was a nomadic city of filth and hunger, a floating continent of misshapen war spheres, some the size of moons, others no larger than cruisers. They were crudely fashioned, pitted with craters and overgrown with alien flora, their hulls patched with salvaged metal and asteroid rock. They drifted lazily, tendrils and feeding tubes siphoning bioplankton from the planet's atmosphere. It looked less like an armada and more like a cosmic garbage patch. By the throne, Gannicus breathed, "What is this foulness?" Corvo's lip curled in disgust. A rabble. A disorganized herd, waiting to be culled. All ships, form line astern. We will execute the Emperor's Wrath maneuver. Broadside engagement protocols. Target their largest vessels first. I want this scrap heap pulverized within the hour. The Imperial fleet moved with the precision of a perfectly crafted machine. Cruisers and battleships formed an unbreakable wall of ceramite and guns, their engines flaring in unison. Vox channels crackled with firing solutions and litanies of hate as the port batteries of the Imperial line erupted, unleashing a wave of incandescent energy and building-sized projectiles that crossed the void in a heartbeat. The lead war spheres were struck by a force that could crack planets. One of the largest spheres, a behemoth 20 kilometers in diameter, shattered, its internal atmosphere exploding outwards in a cloud of green gas, ice, and 10 million spinning Kroot bodies. A cheer went up on the bridge of the Fist of Piety. The first blow was a decisive one, but the Kroot response was not what they expected. There was no retreat, no attempt to return fire in a conventional sense. Instead, the entire garbage patch of ships surged forward. They did not maneuver, they stampeded. Smaller vessels, little more than hollowed-out asteroids with drives, accelerated to impossible speeds, their sole purpose to ram the Imperial escort. Frigates and destroyers, built to dodge torpedoes, found themselves unable to evade planetoids on a collision course. The disciplined Imperial line began to fray as ships broke formation to avoid being crushed. "They are not fighting us, my lord," Gannicus said, his voice laced with disbelief as he watched a war sphere simply absorb a full lance strike, the energy dissipating into its fleshy, regenerative hull. "They are stampeding through us." It was then that the true horror began. Hatches opened on the surfaces of the war spheres, not to reveal weapon batteries, but to disgorge clouds of Kroot warriors in crude void suits. They were fired from cannons, launched in armored pods, or simply leapt into the void, using their powerful legs to cross the distance between ships. It was a tide of living bodies, a swarm of green-skinned locusts, descending upon the steel hides of the Imperial Navy. They hit the hulls not with the clang of metal, but with a wet, percussive thud. Then they began to eat. Their sharp beaks and claws tore at sensor arrays, weapon emplacements, and viewports. The Fist of Piety's guns continued to fire, vaporizing thousands of the boarders with every blast, but for every 1,000 slain, 10,000 more took their place. Warning, klaxons blared across the bridge as proximity alerts screamed from every sector of the hull. "Boarders, they are on the hull! Decks Shibi through POW ship, report multiple breaches! They are chewing through the armor." Corvo watched in cold fury as a Dauntless-class cruiser, the Sword of Viridia, was overwhelmed. Kroot warriors had swarmed its engines, tearing away the outer plating until they reached the plasma conduits within. The ship bloomed into a silent, white-hot flower of death. This was not war. It was butchery. The Kroot were not trying to capture ships. They were treating them as colossal metal carcasses to be cracked open for the meat inside. A thunderous impact shook the Fist of Piety from stem to stern, throwing half the bridge crew from their feet. "Collision alert! A smaller sphere has embedded itself in the aft command tower. Gannicus yelled, pointing to a distorted view screen. They are cutting their way through. The fight for the flagship was short and brutal. Voidsmen in the corridors, trained for ship-to-ship combat, were met by a tide of shrieking, leaping aliens who fought with the ferocity of starving animals. Gun lines were flanked in moments, barricades torn down by sheer numbers. The battle was not fought in corridors, but in waves of flesh that filled them completely. Corvo drew his power sword, its energy field humming to life as the final adamantium blast doors to the bridge buckled, dented inwards by dozens of impacts. "For the Emperor!" he roared as the doors were ripped from their hinges. The first wave of Kroot poured through, their black eyes devoid of anything but predatory hunger. Corvo and his bridge guard met them, a tiny island of gold and crimson against a sea of green. The Lord Admiral fought like a demigod of old, his blade cleaving Xenos in two, his plasma pistol burning holes in their ranks. But the tide was endless. Gannicus fell, a dozen beaks tearing at his throat. The astropaths in their alcoves screamed as they were dragged down. Finally, only Corvo remained, standing on a mound of alien and human corpses. Through the press of bodies, a larger Kroot pushed its way forward. It was a shaper, its quills long and braided with the bones of its enemies. Its eyes glowed with a faint but familiar emerald light. It held no weapon. It simply looked at Corvo, at his gleaming power sword, at his pristine uniform, and then it lunged. Corvo's last sensation was not of a blade or a bullet, but of a crushing grip and a beak that snapped down upon his head, cracking his skull like a nutshell to feast upon the centuries of tactical genius within. Aboard the frigate Vigil's Oath, Commander Valens was screaming at his helmsman, "Get us out! Emergency jump, now!" His ship was one of the few survivors, having been on the periphery of the battle. He had watched the pride of Battlefleet Hydrafer be dismantled, eaten, and destroyed in less than 3 hours. Through his main view screen, he saw the Kroot swarm over the carcass of the Fist of Piety, stripping it of metal, flesh, and technology. They were replenishing their losses and their resources from the very fleet sent to destroy them. As the navigators prepared the jump, the ship's sole surviving astropath began to convulse, transmitting one last, desperate message towards Segmentum Command on Terra. Her psychic voice was a wail of pure terror, a message that would burn itself into the minds of all who received it. It spoke of a fleet of millions of spheres, of a hunger that consumed worlds and stars alike. It gave the Exodus a name born from the trail of dead, stripped worlds they left in their wake, scoured down to their red, iron-rich soil. The Crimson Migration. Then, as the Vigil's Oath plunged into the madness of the warp, the Kroot fleet, now larger and stronger than before, corrected its course and continued its inexorable journey towards the galactic core. The psychic death scream of Battlefleet Hydrafer was not a message, it was a wound. It tore through the tortured minds of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica on Terra, a tsunami of raw, primal terror that left a dozen masters of the choir dead in their thrones, black blood weeping from their eyes. The final, terrified transmission from the Vigil's Oath was the shrapnel from that explosion, a shard of information embedded in an overwhelming wave of agony. For days, the Sanctum Imperialis, that hollowed-out mountain of governance at the heart of the throne world, was a hive of frantic activity. Data servitors chittered and clanked, cogitators churned through contradictory reports, and high-ranking officials scurried through halls vast enough to have their own weather systems. Finally, the High Lords of Terra convened in the Chamber of Solemn Judgment. 12 thrones of obsidian and gold circled a hollow pit that currently displayed a swirling, angry red stain representing the Kroot's path of destruction. Fabricator General Kelbor Hal IX, a being more machine than man, spoke first, his voice a synthesized monotone that carried no emotion, only data. The logistical impossibilities are threefold. 1. The reported numbers of the Xenos fleet are beyond any known census of their species by a factor of 10,000. 2. Their capacity for sustained void travel without a commensurate industrial base is a paradox. 3. The speed of their advance suggests a singular, unwavering objective. The data is incomplete, heretical. Lord Commander Militant Vashka Var, a bull of a man whose face was a roadmap of scars, slammed a gauntleted fist on his throne's armrest. Data be damned. A Gloriana-class vessel and its entire battle group have been annihilated. Lord Admiral Corvo is dead. This is not a migration. It is an invasion of unprecedented scale. I am recommending the immediate mobilization of 3 full army groups from the Cadian sector reserves and the formation of a punitive fleet. It was Inquisitor Lord Xanthus of the Ordo Xenos who silenced them all. He was a wraith in the chamber, his face hidden in the cowl of his black robes, his presence a pool of cold silence. "You are thinking too small, Lord Commander," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You see an invasion. The Fabricator General sees a paradox. I see a shadow of the past. I see the beast, a Xenos species, long considered a manageable, if irritating, threat, suddenly unifying on a galactic scale, driven by a singular purpose and displaying capabilities far beyond our estimations. This is how it began then. This is how it begins now. The name of the beast hung in the air, a curse from 6,000 years prior that still haunted the Imperium's highest echelons. The memory of orc attack, moons hanging over Terra itself was a fear that never truly died. Xanthus continued, his voice hardening. This Crimson Migration is not a war for territory. It is a biological crusade. The astropathic echoes speak of hunger, of consumption. They do not conquer, they devour. A threat of this nature, existential and absolute, cannot be met with a punitive fleet. It must be met with utter, unquestioning annihilation. I am invoking my authority to recommend threat level Omega. We will not punish this species. We will erase it from the memory of the stars. A grave silence fell upon the chamber. Threat level Omega was the final sanction, the edict that licensed genocide on a galactic scale. The Lord Commander Militant nodded slowly, his pragmatic anger replaced by a grim understanding of the stakes. The Fabricator General's optical sensors glowed a brighter crimson, signifying his concurrence. One by one, the High Lords gave their assent. The motion was carried. The Imperium, that vast and grinding engine of war, roared to life. From the fortress monasteries of the Black Templars, Marshal Valorak answered the call, his crusading zeal ignited by the prospect of such a righteous purge. Entire chapters of the Adeptus Astartes were tithed from their duties across the segmentum. On the forge world of Ryza, the Titan legions stirred, their princeps roused from their long slumbers to walk their god machines to war. And from 100 worlds, the regiments of the Astra Militarum were raised, a tide of humanity to be thrown against the Xenos hunger. A new crusade was born, given the designation Metis, after a vengeful goddess from old Earth's forgotten myths. Its mandate was simple and absolute: to intercept the Kroot armada, to break it upon the anvil of imperial might, and to burn every last one of its living ships from the sky. Far across the galaxy, in the calm, ordered heart of the Tau Empire, the news was received not with righteous fury, but with stunned, wounded disbelief. On the capital world of Tiaun, the ethereal supreme, Wanva's holographic successor, presided over an emergency council. The air, usually filled with calm debate, was electric with crisis. Picked feeds from across their territory showed the same impossible scenes. Kroot warriors abandoning their posts mid-battle, leaving Fire Warrior cadres to be overwhelmed. Kroot war spheres detaching from Tau fleets without a word, crippling their strategic strength. Kroot enclaves on Tau-held worlds emptying overnight. The inhabitants marching in silent columns to escavenged transports. Commander Shadowsun stood before the council, her helmet off, her face a mask of cold, controlled anger. "It is a betrayal of the highest order," she stated, her voice sharp and clear. "For centuries they have been our allies, partners in the expansion of the greater good. Now they have deserted us on 1,000 battlefields. We have lost more territory in a single rotation than we have in the last century of the Damocles Gulf Crusade. They have left us exposed, vulnerable." An air-cased representative shimmered into view. "Their fleets are not attacking us, Commander. They are simply leaving. They ignore all hails. They are moving in a single, coordinated vector towards the galactic core. This is not an act of war against the Empire. It is something else. It is madness," Shadowsun countered. "Our intelligence, gathered from the few loyalist kindreds who resisted the call, speaks of an ancient prophecy, a great hunt. They seek to consume a nascent warp entity. It is a suicidal, self-destructive act of supreme folly. They have been driven insane by their own savage superstitions." The ethereal supreme raised a hand, and silence fell. "The failure is not theirs alone, Commander. It is ours. That a species so long integrated into the Talva could revert to such base instinct suggests a flaw in our own teachings. They are a limb of the greater good that has become diseased. It must be treated, not amputated. And if the disease resists treatment? Shadow Sun asked, her gaze unwavering. Then the limb must be constrained, lest it poisons the entire body. The ethereal replied, its voice serene yet absolute. You will take command, Shadow Sun. You will assemble the finest ships of the Korvatra, the swiftest hunter cadres, the most advanced prototypes from the Earth caste. You will pursue the Kroot fleet. Your primary objective is to turn them back. Reason with their shapers. Remind them of their place in the greater good. If reason fails, you will use force. Cripple their war spheres. Break their chain of command. End this great hunt before it leads our entire species to ruin. This is not a war of extermination. It is a mission of reclamation. Shadow Sun bowed, the command settling upon her shoulders like a shroud. She would hunt the hunters. But deep within her, the strategist's logic warred with the sting of betrayal. She had bled alongside the Kroot. Now, she was being ordered to bring them to heel. Like a pack of errant animals, a vast reclamation fleet began to assemble over the skies of Sazay. A gleaming spear of advanced technology poised to strike at the heart of their former allies. Yet a third power had also felt the tremor of the coming storm. On the bridge of the Wordbearer's battle barge, Lectitio Divinitatis, Dark Apostle Malcor Vron, stood before a screaming altar of chained psychers. He was conducting a ritual of divination, reading the entrails of the warp as they manifested in the dying thoughts of his victim. For weeks, his sorcerers had spoken of a disturbance, not a storm or a surge of power, but the opposite, a growing quiet, a patch of unnatural stillness in the glorious cacophony of the Empyrean. As the final psycher's mind shattered, the truth was revealed to Vran in a torrent of blasphemous visions. He saw a silent god being born in a cradle of dead stars. He saw its essence, not rage or lust or cunning or despair, but a profound and utter cessation, quiescence, an end to all things. It was a concept so alien to the passions of chaos that it was a divine novelty, a new flavor of faith in a cosmos grown stale with the endless war of the four great powers. Vran threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing through the cathedral bridge like the cracking of bones. His followers, the crimson-clad traitors of the XVAI Legion, looked to him for guidance. A miracle, Vran bellowed, his voice amplified by the vox grills of his helmet. The fools on Terra see a Xenos threat. The pathetic Tau see a betrayal. They are blind. We alone have been granted the vision to see the truth. A new god seeks to enter the stage of creation. He pointed a clawed gauntlet at the star chart, where his sorcerers had marked the focal point of the psychic silence. The primitives, the Kroot, have sensed it too. They flock to it like beasts to a salt lick, driven by their base instincts. They seek to devour it, to steal its divinity for their own pathetic evolution. Such ignorance cannot be permitted. He turned to face his rapt audience, his own eyes glowing with the fire of fanaticism. We shall make our own pilgrimage. We will find this nascent power, and we will be its first supplicants. We will teach it the true meaning of worship. We will write its gospels in the blood of its enemies, and we will bind it to the service of the primordial truth and the will of our blessed father Lorgar. The Emperor's children may seek it for sensation, the Death Guard to see it rot. But we, the bearers of the word, shall claim its very soul. A roar of zealous approval shook the ship. The word-bearers had their new crusade. Their fleet, a dark mirror of the Imperial Armada, turned its prows towards the same destination as the Kroot. Three great fleets, born of faith, pragmatism, and betrayal, were now on a collision course. The galaxy was converging on the path of the Crimson Migration, each faction believing it could control the storm, unaware that they were all about to be consumed by it. Voltarn was the breadbasket of the Hydrafer sector. It was a world without grand monuments or adamantium fortresses, its value measured not in strategic position, but in trillions of tons of harvested grain and billions of head of grah. Its skies were a placid blue, its continents vast, rolling plains of gold and green, sectioned into continent-spanning fields by rivers that ran as straight and true as a surveyor's line. The people of Voltarn were sturdy, pious folk, their lives governed by the seasons of sowing and reaping. They paid their tithe in flesh and food, and in return, the Imperium left them largely in peace. Their defenders were the Voltarnian Dragoons, 5 full regiments of disciplined professional soldiers, famed for their marksmanship and their unshakable resolve in holding a line. They were veterans of a dozen campaigns, but their wars had always been fought on other worlds, in shattered cities and toxic ash wastes. They had never had to defend their own soil. Lord General Militant Tiberius Gage, commander of the Voltarnian Defense Forces, stood in the central cogitator sanctum of Bastion Primus, the planet's single fortified capital city. He was a man carved from granite and duty, his face a testament to a life spent in service to the throne. The reports of Battlefleet Hydraffer's demise had reached him days ago, a chilling whisper from the void that promised a coming storm. He had done all he could. The harvests were gathered into fortified silos, the populations of the outlying farmsteads evacuated towards the planetary capital, and his dragoons were dug in along a series of defensive lines that radiated from Bastion Primus for 1,000 kilometers in every direction. The storm arrived not with a thunderclap, but as a slow, creeping eclipse. The Kroot fleet translated into high orbit, a swarm so vast it blotted out the sun. The sky of Voltarn turned from blue to a sickly mottled twilight as the shadow of the Great Hunt fell upon it. The planet's orbital defense platforms, ancient and powerful laser arrays, roared to life, lancing beams of pure energy into the assembled armada. They struck true, carving molten wounds into the hulls of several warspheres. But the wounds sealed themselves, the strange organic matter regenerating with unnatural speed. And for every platform that fired, a dozen smaller Kroot vessels detached from the main fleet and simply dove at them, kamikaze attacks that smashed the priceless archaeotech stations into silent, tumbling wreckage. Within an hour, Voltarn was blind and defenseless. Then came the landing. It was not a military invasion. It was a biological seeding. From the bellies of the war spheres, a deluge of spores, pods, and living projectiles rained down, covering the entire planet in a blanket of alien life. They fell into the golden grain fields, the lush forests, and the teeming Grox pastures. They were not aiming for cities or military targets. They were aiming for biomass. The war for Voltarn began in a field of ripening grain. A platoon of dragoons, dug into a trench line, watched as the pods around them burst open. Kroot warriors, slick with amniotic fluid, unfolded and rose, their beady eyes instantly locking onto the nearest source of protein. There was no battle cry, only a universal chittering shriek of hunger. The order was given. Volley fire by the numbers. 1,000 lasguns cracked as one, a ripple of red light that scythed through the first wave of Xenos. The Kroot fell, their bodies torn apart by the focused energy, but the wave behind them did not falter. They clambered over their own dead, a tide of green flesh and sharp beaks. This scene was repeated 1,000,000 times across the surface of the planet. The Voltarnian dragoons found themselves in a unique kind of hell. Their enemy did not seek cover. It did not employ strategy. It did not try to outmaneuver them. It simply charged, heedless of losses, driven by a single, overriding imperative: to feed. The trenches became meat grinders. The dragoons fired until their charge packs ran dry, swapped them, and fired again. The barrels of their heavy bolters glowed white-hot, spitting explosive death into the horde. Artillery batteries miles behind the lines rained down shells that turned acres of land and the Kroot upon it into vaporized gore. But the horde never stopped. And then came the true horror. The dragoons saw that the Kroot were not merely ignoring their dead, they were recycling them. In any lull in the fighting, Kroot would swarm their fallen comrades, tearing them apart and consuming them with feverish haste. They were a perfectly efficient war machine, one whose casualties provided the fuel to continue the assault. Worse, they did the same to the Imperial dead. Troopers dragged from the trenches were not just killed, they were torn limb from limb and devoured on the spot by dozens of snapping beaks. The war for Voltarn was not a battle for ground, it was a fight to avoid being eaten. In his sanctum, Lord General Militant Gage watched the strategic hololith with cold, dead eyes. Entire regiments were being erased from the map, their icons flickering from green to red to black in the space of hours. The outer defensive lines had been breached, not through tactical failure, but through simple biological attrition. The Kroot had filled the trenches with their own bodies until they could walk over them. "Sir, the 4th Regiment reports their northern flank has collapsed," an Ide reported, his voice shaking. "They are being consumed. Literally. They are requesting permission to fall back to the Gorgon line." "Negative," Gage said, his voice hard as iron. "There is no falling back. There is only holding. Every minute you stand your ground is another minute the harvest in the capital's silos is safe. Every Kroot that dies, taking your position, is one less that will reach the walls of Bastion Primus. You know the orders." The orders were brutal. The Gorgon line was to be Gage's final redoubt before the capital itself. Everything outside it was to be denied to the enemy. As the dragoons made their fighting retreat towards it, the Earthshaker cannons behind them changed their targets. They no longer fired on the Kroot, but on the fields, the silos, the Grox herds, a scorched earth policy of planetary scale. Shells filled with promethium and chemical fire turned the breadbasket of the sector into a sea of flames. The golden fields became black ash, the rivers boiled. It was a monstrous act of self-destruction, a final, spiteful denial of sustenance to the invaders. For a time, it worked. The Kroot swarms, finding their feeding grounds turned to poison and fire, faltered. Their advance slowed as the sheer lack of biomass began to starve them. But the Great Hunt was not so easily denied. It adapted. The war spheres in orbit began to drop larger, more specialized organisms, colossal bio-behemoths that resembled walking stomachs. These creatures ignored the ash and fire, their purpose solely to devour soil, rock, and anything else they could find, processing it into a nutrient sludge that was then fed to the warriors. The planetary unmaking of Voltarn had begun. Gage stood on the highest rampart of Bastion Primus, looking out through macrobinocular. The horizon, once a gentle line of green and gold, was now a jagged, moving wall of green flesh. The Kroot horde, trillions strong, stretched from one end of the world to the other, a living ocean of hunger that was now converging on this final island of resistance. The fires of the plains cast a hellish red glow on the scene. His dragoons stood ready on the walls, their faces grim, their lasguns charged. They knew there would be no rescue. The Crusade fleet metis was weeks away. Their duty was not to win, but to die, in such a way that their deaths had meaning. They were to be the bone in the throat of the Great Hunt, to choke it for as long as they could. Voltarn was no longer a world, it was an abattoir, and its gates were about to be breached. The siege of Bastion Primus was not a siege in any traditional sense. It was a geological event, a tidal wave of living matter crashing against the fortress city's adamantium and plasteel wall. For 30 days and 30 nights, the defenders of Voltarn held against the abyss. The automated defense turrets on the walls fired until their ammunition conduits melted. The Voltarnian dragoons fired until their shoulders were bruised black from the recoil of their lasguns. The air became a permanent howling storm of lasfire, bolt shells, and the unending, chittering shriek of the Kroot horde. Lord General Militant Gage lived on the command throne of the Bastion's highest spire, a sleepless sentinel watching his world be eaten. He allocated reserves with cold precision, shoring up sections of the wall that threatened to buckle under the sheer weight of bodies pressed against them. He directed artillery strikes into the thickest concentrations of the horde, knowing that the thousands he killed would be replaced in minutes. His genius was not in flamboyant maneuvers, but in the grim mathematical calculus of attrition. He was trading the lives of his beloved soldiers for hours, for minutes, buying time for the wider Imperium to recognize and react to the scale of the threat. Yet, he knew it was a battle he could not win. The Kroot were relentless, their minds entirely subsumed by the singular divine purpose of the hunt. But they were not stupid. Amidst the chaos of the swarm, a terrifying intelligence was beginning to emerge. The horde had a shepherd. From a vantage point atop a mound of his own species dead, Master Shaper Encore Proke watched the siege with ancient, patient eyes. He was a gnarled and primeval creature, his green hide scarred with the marks of 1,000 battles, his head quills long and woven with the spinal columns of creatures from forgotten worlds. He was the prophet of the Great Hunt, the first to hear the psychic whisper of the nascent god, and its most fervent apostle. To him, this battle was not a war, but a necessary act of consumption before the final feast. He saw the city not as a fortress, but as a shell, a hard carapace, protecting a morsel of rich, concentrated biomass. He had studied its defenses, not by poring over schematics, but by observing the patterns of death. He saw which sections of the wall were repaired the fastest, where the return fire was most accurate, where the reserves were deployed from. He felt the rhythm of the defense, the heartbeat of the single military mind that directed it. And he knew, with a predator's instinct, that to break the shell, he must first devour the heart. Proc issued no commands through a Vox-net. He did not need to. He was the apex of his kind, and his will resonated through the lesser Kroot around him as a psychic imperative, a pure and undeniable instinct. He began to gather his chosen warriors, the Krotox riders, and the hulking Kroot hounds, not for a frontal assault, but for a focused, surgical strike. He had identified the command spire where the Lord General Militant resided, the nexus of Voltarn's defiance. The final assault began under the dim light of Voltarn's scarred moon. It was not a wave, but a spear. Proc had his warriors sacrifice themselves by the tens of thousands, creating a ramp of their own corpses against one specific section of the wall. A ramp that reached higher and higher until it crested the battlements. While the dragoons on either side were engaged in the endless slaughter, Proc led his elite kindred over the top, a silent, deadly intrusion into the city's dying body. The fighting within Bastion Primus was a nightmare of close-quarters butchery. In the grand plazas and ceremonial avenues, the neat firing lines of the dragoons were useless. The Kroot were upon them, a whirlwind of claws and beaks. It was a battle of bayonet and rifle butt against the raw animal fury of the Xenos. Gage saw the breach on the tactical display, a blossoming red stain in the city's northwestern quadrant. He saw the spearhead of the Kroot advance, ignoring all other targets, heading directly, unerringly, for the command spire. He knew then that he had been targeted. He was the prey. A grim, final smile touched his lips. He had held the line his entire life. He would not falter. Now, all remaining forces of the Spire Guard. He commanded into his personal vox, his voice calm and steady amidst the cacophony of alarms. Form a defensive perimeter around the sanctum. Hold until the last man. The Emperor protects. He drew his ceremonial power sword, a weapon that had not been wielded in battle for 500 years, and stood at the top of the grand staircase that led to his command throne. His personal guard, 50 of the finest soldiers in the entire Voltarnian Dragoon Corps, clad in gleaming carapace armor, formed a shield wall around him. The Kroot came, not as a mindless horde, but as a disciplined pack of hunters. They flowed up the grand staircase, silent and swift. At their head was Angkor Proc. The Master Shaper met Gage's gaze across the marble expanse. There was a moment of perfect stillness, the calm at the heart of the storm, as the two commanders acknowledged each other. Then Proc shrieked, a sound that was both a challenge and a prayer, and his hunters charged. The Spire Guard fought with the courage of legends. Their hotshot las guns blasted gaping holes in the charging Kroot, but the aliens' sheer momentum carried them into the Imperial line. The fight devolved into a chaotic melee on the staircase. Proc ignored it all. His eyes were only for Gage. He bounded over the struggling bodies of his own warriors, his movements impossibly fast, and launched himself at the Lord General Militant. Gage was no mere administrator. He was a warrior of the Imperium, and his reactions were honed by centuries of training. He met Proc's charge, his power sword clashing against the Shaper's sharpened, fossilized arm blades. The air crackled with displaced energy. For a man of his age, Gage was inhumanly strong, his blows powerful enough to cleave a lesser creature in two. But Proc was faster, more agile, a whirlwind of feral grace. He dodged and weaved, his blades chipping at Gage's armor, seeking a weakness. They dueled amidst the wreckage of the command sanctum, two masters of war locked in a primal contest. Gage fought for duty, for honor, for the memory of the world he had failed to protect. Proc fought for destiny, for evolution, for the taste of the knowledge locked within his opponent's skull. The duel ended not with a grand flourish, but with a moment of brutal expediency. Proc fainted low, and as Gage adjusted his guard, the Master Shaper spat a thick, corrosive enzyme directly into the Lord General's face. Gage roared in agony as his visor melted, and the flesh beneath began to sizzle and dissolve. Blinded and screaming, he swung his sword wildly. Proc ducked under the desperate attack, drove his arm blade through a joint in Gage's armor and into his heart. Lord General Militant Tiberius Gage fell to his knees, his lifeblood pouring onto the floor of his sanctum. Angkor Proc did not savor the victory. He leaned down, and with a swift, practiced motion, he tore the dying general's head from his shoulders. He held it aloft for a moment, and then, before the horrified eyes of the last few surviving Spire Guard, he bit into it, cracking the cranium and consuming the brain within. A jolt, more powerful than any psychic shock, ran through the Master Shaper. Memories, not his own, flooded his consciousness. He saw Gage's childhood on Voltarn, his first day at the Schola Progenium, his triumphs on a dozen battlefields. He saw tactics, strategies, logistical chains, the precise, ordered doctrines of the Astra Militarum. He absorbed it all. The brute cunning of the Kroot was suddenly tempered and honed by the cold, brilliant logic of an imperial general. Proc straightened up, his black eyes no longer just predatory, but calculating. He looked at the chaos of the battle around him. He looked at the tactical display, which still showed the disposition of the remaining Imperial forces. and with the stolen genius of his fallen foe, he began to issue new commands. Not through instinct, but through a series of precise, sharp clicks and shrieks, he directed his Kroot. He sent one group to sabotage the Bastion's primary power generator, another to seize the main ammunition depots. He orchestrated a multi-pronged assault that systematically dismantled the city's remaining defenses with terrifying, inhuman efficiency. The fall of Bastion Primus, which should have been a bloody day-long grind, was over in less than an hour. The Voltarnian Dragoons, their command structure shattered, and their enemy now moving with the coordinated precision of one of their own, were cut down and consumed. The war for Voltarn was over. The Great Hunt feasted upon the ruins, gorging on the last vestiges of life on the dead world. And at its head now stood a legend, a prophet who had consumed not just the flesh, but the very mind of his enemy, a predator who now wielded the tactical genius of the Imperium like a stolen sword. The feast upon Voltarn was a silent, methodical affair. There were no victory cries, no boasts of conquest. There was only the sound of consumption, a wet, percussive symphony of cracking bone and tearing flesh that echoed across the ash-strewn plains. The Kroot ascendancy moved with the efficiency of a swarm of locusts, stripping the planet of its final vestiges of biological matter. They rendered down the corpses of the dragoons, the groks, the civilians huddled in their fallen bastion, and even the planet's native fauna, converting it all into the raw energy required for the next leg of their journey. Angkor Proc stood atop the ruined spire of Bastion Primus, his body still, his mind a whirlwind. The memories of General Gage were a foreign object in his consciousness, a crystal of pure logic that he was slowly, painstakingly integrating into his own predatory soul. He saw the galaxy not as a hunting ground, but as a chessboard. He saw supply lines, strategic choke points, and the lumbering, predictable might of the Imperium. For the first time, a Kroot understood his enemy, not by the taste of their flesh, but by the architecture of their thoughts. It was this newfound understanding that allowed him to sense the wrongness in the void before any of his seers did. A tremor, not in real space, but in the deeper currents of the warp, a sour note in the psychic chorus. He looked up from the desolation of Voltarn towards the stars, and he saw them arrive. The fleet of the Wordbearers tore its way into reality with a scream of tortured space-time. These were not the organic, functional vessels of the Kroot, but blasphemous cathedrals of war. Their hulls were the color of dried blood and bruised faith, festooned with chains, screaming icons, and the flayed skins of saints. Colossal braziers burned with unholy light along their spines, and from 1,000 Voss grills, the ceaseless chanting of prayers to the ruinous powers spilled out into the void, a tide of sonnet filth. At the head of this armada of damnation was the Lectitio Divinitatis, a battle barge so ancient and steeped in malice that its very presence seemed to warp the light around it. On its bridge, a space that resembled a desecrated temple more than a command deck, Dark Apostle Malcor Vran watched the Kroot fleet through a shimmering pane of captured souls. He saw the devastation on Voltarn below, the countless green forms stripping the world clean. He felt no admiration for their efficiency, only contempt. Behold the ignorance of the beast. Vran's amplified voice boomed, echoing from the mouths of demonic cherubs that clung to the ceiling. They scrabble for scraps in the dirt, seeking to fill their bellies with mere flesh. They are blind to the true feast that awaits. They are unworthy of the god's notice. He turned to his cabal of sorcerers, their faces pale and tattooed with forbidden runes. The Tri-Sister Systems. Are they prepared? The lead sorcerer bowed low. They are, Dark Apostle. The populations of Misericordia, Dolores, and Lamentia are pacified. The sacrificial circles are complete. The choirs are in place. We await only your word to begin the grand canticle. Then let the galaxy hear our devotion. Vran commanded, a fanatical light burning in his eyes. Let our voices be the midwife to a new divinity. The Wordbearers' fleet split into 3 formations, each descending upon one of the inhabited worlds of the Tri-Sister system. These were not warrior worlds, but peaceful, populous planets dedicated to theological study and clerical administration. Their garrisons were token, their people unprepared for the horror about to befall them. The Wordbearers did not wage war. They conducted a harvest. Trillions of human souls were rounded up by traitor Astartes and gibbering cultists. They were herded into continent-spanning symbols carved into the planet's crust, their despairing cries forming the first verses of Vran's terrible ritual. From the bridge of the Lectitio Divinitatis, Malcor Vran became the conductor of a symphony of sacrifice. He orchestrated the ritual across the three worlds, his voice booming from orbit, a litany of damnation that drove his followers into a frenzy and his victims into utter, soul-shattering terror. On Misericordia, the populace was forced into the choir of sorrows, their vocal cords surgically altered to produce a single, unending note of grief. On Dolorous, they were chained to colossal burning effigies, their agony a pillar of psychic energy that reached into the heavens. On Lamentia, they were simply bled, their lives draining away into the planetary trenches to spell out a single, blasphemous rune visible from space. The combined psychic agony of three worlds, the death scream of trillions, was focused by Vran's sorcerers into a single, cohesive lance of emotional energy. They aimed it not at an enemy fleet, but at the heart of the anathema maw, at the gestating consciousness of the nascent god. It was an offering of unparalleled scale, a gift of pure despair to a being born of sorrow. The warp convulsed. In its cradle of dead stars, the god of quiescence stirred. It had been a formless, dreaming thing, but this sudden, overwhelming influx of focused misery gave it a jolt of self-awareness. It felt the pain of the trillions who had just died in its name, and its first conscious act was to exhale. It was a breath not of air or energy, but of pure emotion. A wave of profound, absolute, and soul-crushing despair washed out from the galactic core, traveling faster than light, faster than thought. It was the divine essence of hopelessness made manifest. Aboard the flagship of Crusade Fleet Metis, the Righteous Fury, Marshal Valorak of the Black Templars was reviewing strike plans with his assembled chapter masters. The fleet was a glorious sight, hundreds of Imperial vessels, a testament to the Emperor's unyielding wrath. Our augurs placed the Xenos vanguard 3 days from the Letha subsector, he was saying, his voice a gravelly boom of conviction. We will meet them there. We will. He stopped. A sudden, inexplicable weight settled upon his soul. The burning fire of his faith, the righteous fury that had sustained him for 5 centuries of warfare, was gone. He looked at the tactical display, at the icons representing his fleet, and felt nothing. No pride, no anger, no duty. Only a vast, gray, empty weariness. What was the point? The Xenos would win, or they would not. The Imperium would stand, or it would fall. It did not matter. Nothing mattered. Across the bridge, the same phenomenon was occurring. A highly disciplined tech priest seized his chant of maintenance, his head slumping forward over his console as the utter futility of preserving the machine spirit overwhelmed him. A master of ordnance, moments from calculating a firing solution, simply let his hands fall to his sides. Why bother? The shells would only be replaced by more shells in an endless, meaningless cycle of violence. The entire bridge crew, from the highest officer to the lowliest servitor, was struck by a spiritual paralysis, a catatonic melancholy that stole their very will to act. The Great Crusade Fleet Metis, the Emperor's own vengeance, did not fall in battle. It simply stopped, its engines cooling, its crews staring blankly into the void, a fleet of ghost ships lost in a sea of their own apathy. Miles away, aboard the Tau vessel, Kalyon's Blade, Commander Shadowsun felt the wave as a sudden, crippling onset of pure, cold logic. The carefully constructed philosophies of the Tauva seemed to collapse in on themselves. The Kroot were a lost cause. The Imperium was too vast to ever be enlightened. The Orcs were an unsolvable equation of violence. The Tyranids were an inevitability. The greater good was a statistical improbability, a foolish dream in a galaxy determined to be a nightmare. Her drive, her determination to reclaim her wayward allies, evaporated, replaced by the calm, rational certainty that her mission was doomed to fail. She saw her crew succumbing to the same malaise, their disciplined movements becoming slow, hesitant, their belief in their purpose visibly draining away. Only the Kroot remained untouched. The psychic wave washed over their fleet, but to them, it was not a weapon, it was a scent, the smell of their prey. The despair and hopelessness that crippled the other races was, to them, the very essence of the divine being they sought. It was a confirmation of their destiny, a taste of the apotheosis to come. The Great Hunt, already moving at a feverish pace, accelerated, its warriors invigorated by the psychic spore of their god. Malcor Vran stood on his bridge and laughed, a sound of pure, triumphant evil. The fleets of his enemies were crippled, their wills broken. He had fed his new god, and in doing so, had cleared the path to its cradle. The unbelievers are scattered, he roared. The beasts are drawn into the open. Now we follow. We will be there to greet our new lord upon his glorious birth. The word has been spoken, and the galaxy will tremble. Not all who heard the psychic music of the nascent god interpreted its song in the same way. Aboard the Warsphere Silent Bow, the ancestral vessel of the Grey Shade kindred, the wave of despair was not a call to feast, but a dire and terrible warning. The Grey Shades were an old and storied lineage, one of the first to enter into a pact with the Tau Empire. For millennia, they had fought alongside fire warriors, eaten alongside water-cased diplomats, and learned from the cool logic of the earth-cased. Their evolutionary path had taken a subtle but significant turn. They had shaped their flesh with the discipline of the orcs and the cunning of humans, but they had shaped their minds with the philosophies of the Teova. They had consumed Tau strategists and pathfinders, and in doing so, had inherited not just their skills, but a fraction of their capacity for long-term strategic thought. Their leader, Shaper Kalar, was a creature of deep thought and quiet contemplation, an anomaly among his kind. His quills were not decorated with bones, but with polished data wafers recovered from fallen Tau commander. He stood on the observation deck of his war sphere, not a part of the main, frenzied armada, but trailing at its edge, a gray shadow in the wake of a green comet. He watched the main fleet, a seething mass of biological imperative, and felt a profound sense of wrongness. This was not the careful, considered predation that had ensured the survival of his species for millions of years. This was a stampede, a blind, suicidal rush towards a poisoned waterhole. When the gods' first psychic breath had washed over them, Klar had not felt the invigorating spore of prey. He had felt the cold, empty truth of the thing they hunted, an entity of pure nihilism. To consume it would not be to gain its strength, but to be infected by its absolute emptiness. It would be the final evolution, an apotheosis into nothingness. The Kroot would cease to be predators. They would become a walking sentient void. Kroot is a fool, Kalar rasped to his gathered kindred shapers. His voice was low, lacking the guttural fire of the other Kroot leaders. He has eaten the mind of one human general and believes he understands the galaxy. He sees a single battle, the grandest hunt. He does not see the war for survival that comes after. He will lead our entire species into oblivion for the sake of a single, glorious meal. One of the younger shapers, his quills still vibrant green, clicked his beak in protest. The master shaper follows destiny. We will become gods. We will become an ending, Klar countered, his gaze sweeping over the assembled leaders. We have served the Tova. We have learned its lessons. A plan without a future is not a plan. It is a death wish. This great hunt is wasteful. It burns our people as fuel. Look at our trajectory. Look at the worlds we have stripped bare. We leave nothing behind. A predator that devours its entire ecosystem starves. Kroot's hunt will be the death of us all, whether he succeeds or fails. The psychic wave had been the final sign. Klar knew he could not sway the trillions of Kroot caught in Kroot's fanatical orbit. To reason with them would be to reason with a flood. But he could wound the beast. He could slow it, and he could, perhaps, give another power the chance to put it down. It was a betrayal of his species, a heresy against the Great Hunt. But to Klar's Tau-inflected mind, it was the only logical course of action. A legacy of ash was preferable to a legacy of nothing. The Great Hunt is a sickness, Klar declared, his decision made, and we will be the cauterizing fire. We will not win, we will not survive. But we will send a message. The Grey Shade Kindred, a force of some 20 warspheres and their auxiliary craft, broke from the trailing edge of the Kroot armada. They did not flee, they turned, their organic engines flaring with sudden, violent purpose, and dove into the heart of the fleet's rear guard. Their target was a cluster of scavenger spheres, colossal, slow-moving vessels responsible for processing the biomass from consumed worlds and recycling the dead. They were the logistical heart of the armada, the stomach of the Great Hunt. The attack was a masterpiece of controlled violence. The Grey Shades did not swarm. They fought like the fire warriors they had served alongside for centuries. Their war spheres moved into precise firing formations, focusing their bioplasma cannons on single targets. Their Krootox riders, instead of charging wildly, formed mobile fire bases, their powerful cannons laying down suppressing fire. It was Kroot savagery, guided by the cold tenets of the Kaoyong. The Kroot of the main fleet were caught completely by surprise. The concept of a Kroot turning on another Kroot during the Great Hunt was so alien, so unthinkable, that their initial response was confusion. That confusion turned to rage. 1,000 warspheres, vessels from the Bloodied Beak and Iron Quill kindreds, turned to crush the traitors. The battle was a brief, horrific spectacle. It was the sound of a species eating itself. War spheres rammed into one another, tearing gaping holes in their living hulls. The void between them was filled with a maelstrom of green bodies as kindred fought kindred in zero gravity. It was a chaotic, fratricidal nightmare, a civil war fought in the space of a few 100,000 kilometers. The Greyshade kindred fought with the grim determination of the doomed. Shaper Klar stood on the bridge of the Silent Bow as it was torn apart by the ramming prow of a much larger vessel. Alarms shrieked as the ship's internal atmosphere vented into the void, carrying with it hundreds of his warriors. He ignored the chaos, his gnarled fingers working frantically on a Tau-built long-range comms unit, a piece of technology he had guarded for decades. He was rerouting all of the Warsphere's remaining energy into a single, tight beam transmission. He aimed it not at Proc, nor at Terra, but towards the last known position of the Tiao reclamation fleet. He did not know if they had survived the psychic wave. He did not know if they would even receive his message. But it was the only chance. As his ship died around him, he began to transmit everything. The complete astrogation charts of the Great Hunt, their intended destination, the Anathema Maw, their speed and estimated numbers, the full account of Angkor Proc's rise, his consumption of General Gauge, and his ultimate goal. He sent spectrographic analysis of the psychic wave and his own Shaper's interpretation of its nature, a nascent god of absolute nullity. It was a treasure trove of intelligence, a key to understanding and perhaps defeating the apocalyptic threat the Kroot had become. On the bridge of the Kaoyan's Blade, Commander Shadowsun was slowly pulling her command staff out of their collective, logic-induced despair. The Tova was a robust philosophy. It bent, but it did not easily break. She was reinstilling purpose, reminding them of duty, of the greater good. It was then that the message arrived. It was not a Tau signal, but it used Tau encryption protocols, old ones but recognizable. "Commander, we are receiving a tight beam transmission," a communications officer announced, his voice still tinged with the apathy of the psychic wave. "It is Kroot in origin, but it is not a hail, it is a data burst, a massive one." Shadowsun's focus returned in an instant, a blade being honed. "Put it on the main screen, decrypt it, now." The data flooded the holodisplays, star charts, tactical dispositions, biological analyses, and a final audio message, recorded in the Tao tongue, spoken with the harsh, clicking accent of a Kroot. "To the Tau, to Commander Shadowsun. We, the Greyshade kindred, hold to our pact. The Great Hunt is a madness that will consume the galaxy. The Shapers are blind. The prey they seek is a poison for all life. We cannot stop them. We are undone. But we give you the means. Avenge us. Avenge the greater good. For the future." The message ended in a burst of static and the sound of tearing metal. Shadowsun watched the final pict capture that accompanied the data burst, a small fleet of warspheres being utterly annihilated by a sea of their brethren. The betrayal that had wounded her empire so deeply was now, in a final, tragic act, a gift. A Kroot's loyalty had given her a weapon to use against the Kroot's heresy. The fog of despair on her bridge seemed to burn away, replaced by the cold, clear light of purpose. "Helm," she commanded, her voice ringing with its old authority. "Plot a course to intercept these coordinates. Send the data to the entire fleet. We are no longer on a mission of reclamation. We are on a mission of salvation. The hunt ends now." The Great Hunt was a living engine, and its fuel was life itself. As the Armada plunged deeper into the haunted, unexplored regions near the galactic core, the very concept of logistics became a daily, desperate struggle for survival, fought on a scale that beggared the imagination. The path of the Crimson Migration was a corridor of absolute death, not just of inhabited worlds, but of any system that held even the faintest glimmer of biological promise. The Kroot's hunger was not discriminating, it was total. Aboard the Warsphere Gnawed Bone, the young Kroot warrior Skralk felt the gnawing emptiness in his third stomach, a constant, dull ache that had become his reality. His kindred, the Stonebeaks, had been a proud and numerous clan. Now they were a shadow of their former selves, clinging to existence on a vessel that was itself starving. The Gnawed Bone was no longer the vibrant, teeming ecosystem it had once been. The hydroponic fungus farms in its lower chambers had withered and died, their nutrient reserves exhausted weeks ago. The herds of captured groks and other beasts that had once roamed its cavernous interiors had long since been consumed. The great recycling vats, which turned waste into protein paste, now bubbled with a thin, watery gruel that barely sustained life. Skralk remembered Voltarn. He remembered the feast, the glorious, unending bounty of flesh and blood that had filled their bellies and strengthened their sinews. The memory was a torment, a vision of paradise lost. After Voltarn, the pickings had grown slim. They had descended upon a system with a single, life-bearing ice moon. They had cracked its frozen crust and devoured the bioluminescent trilobites that swam in its subsurface ocean. It had been a meager, unsatisfying meal, a sip of water for a creature dying of thirst. Then came the gas giant of a nameless blue star. The Shapers had proclaimed it rich in atmospheric life. The fleet had spent a week siphoning its upper layers, filtering out vast, jelly-like floaters and sky rays. But this biomass was thin, barely providing enough energy to offset what was expended in the harvest. The ache in Skralk's stomach had grown sharper. Now the weakest were beginning to die. The old, the sick, and the young who had not yet been properly blooded were succumbing to starvation. At first, their bodies were given the hunter's farewell, their flesh honorably consumed by their kin to give them strength. It was the Kroot way, but now, death was so common that the rituals were abandoned. A corpse was no longer a fallen warrior. It was just meat, to be claimed by the swiftest and the strongest. Skralk had seen fights break out over a single fallen elder, the bonds of kindred forgotten in the face of animalistic need. The fabric of their society was fraying, worn thin by the abrasive reality of their voyage. The Shapers' chants of the glorious feast to come, of the divine apotheosis that awaited them, now sounded hollow, distant. Destiny was an abstract concept. Starvation was a physical reality. The crisis was not confined to the lesser kindred. Angkor Prok, from his new command sphere fashioned from the fused wreckage of Imperial vessels and Kroot biomatter, saw the logistics of his crusade collapsing. The memories of General Gage had given him an understanding of supply lines, and he saw his own with terrifying clarity. They were non-existent. The Great Hunt was devouring its own tail. The schism of the Greyshade kindred, while militarily insignificant, had been a blow to morale and, more practically, had cost him a full cycle's worth of processed biomass. His solution was as brutal as it was pragmatic. A decree was issued, not in words, but as a psychic pulse of cold, hard intent that washed over the entire fleet. The culling had begun. The weaker kindred, those whose war spheres were failing or whose warrior counts had fallen below a certain threshold, were declared unfit for the final hunt. They were no longer hunters, they were now prey. Skralk felt the change as a shift in the way the larger war spheres of the apex kindreds looked at the Gnawed Bone. Their gazes were no longer those of fellow travelers, but of predators sizing up a wounded animal. The Stonebeak kindred was on the list. They were marked for consumption. Panic and rage erupted on the Gnawed Bone. The Shaper of the Stonebeaks, a proud warrior named Gruul, shrieked his defiance. "We are hunters! We have followed Prok since the unbinding! He would have us feed his chosen few with our flesh? Never!" Their defiance was futile. A warsphere of the Iron Quill kindred, a vessel twice their size and bristling with biocannons, moved to intercept them. Its maw-like hatches opened, and boarding parties launched themselves across the void. The battle was a foregone conclusion. The Stonebeaks were weak, starving, their movements sluggish. The warriors of the Iron Quill were well-fed, their muscles strong, their eyes burning with the Master Shaper's righteous purpose. Skralk fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. He tore the throat out of one attacker with his beak and shattered the arm of another with his rifle butt. But they were too many. He was overwhelmed, beaten to the deck, and his rifle was kicked from his grasp. He lay there, helpless, as the Iron Quill warriors began the butchery of his kin, dragging the living and the dead alike back to their own vessel. This was not the honorable consumption of the dead. This was cannibalism as an act of policy. But Skralk was not killed. A hulking Iron Quill Shaper stood over him, examining him with a critical eye. "This one is strong," the Shaper grunted. "Good muscle, sharp quills. He is worthy." Skralk and a few hundred other prime warriors of the Stonebeaks were spared. They were not, however, welcomed as brothers. They were disarmed and herded into pens in the bowels of the Iron Quill warsphere, like captured groks. They were property now, a living larder. They were fed the processed remains of their own kindred, a thin, nutrient-rich slurry designed to keep them strong until they were needed for what they did not know. The path of the Crimson Migration was now marked not only by the dead worlds it left behind, but by the floating, cannibalized husks of its own ships. The Great Hunt was purifying itself, shedding its weakest elements, consolidating its strength into a smaller, more elite but utterly fanatical core. The cost of war was measured in the billions of Kroot lives sacrificed not to an enemy, but to the ravenous appetite of their own crusade. Skrauk, sitting in the filth of his pen, felt the last vestiges of his faith in the Great Hunt die. There was no glory here. There was no destiny. There was only hunger, an endless, all-consuming hunger that had turned its gaze inward and was now devouring the very soul of his species. The Anathema Maw was a hole in the universe. It was a dead star system, a graveyard of celestial bodies orbiting a black hole whose gravitational pull was so immense it seemed to drain the color and light from the surrounding space. This was the edge of the Pariah Nexus, a region still echoing with the silent scream of the Necron's galactic null field. Here, the veil between reality and the warp was not thin. It was shredded, a tattered curtain of cosmic law that fluttered in an unseen wind. It was in this non-place, this confluence of physical and psychic voids, that the god of quiescence had chosen to be born. The Kroot Armada, now leaner, more scarred, and more fanatically determined than ever, limped into the system. The survivors of the culling, the apex kindreds, personally chosen by Angkor Prok, gazed upon the heart of the Maw. There was no planet, no sun, only a shimmering, indistinct sphere of non-light hanging in the void. It was not a physical object, but a psychic construct, a nascent reality bubble where the god was taking form. It was a realm of pure thought and sorrow, a sanctum woven from the aether. To the naked eye, it was a distortion in the starfield. To the Kroot's heightened senses, it was a beacon, a scent, the culmination of their entire species' history. Angkor Prok stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Grave Eater. His consciousness expanded by the stolen intellect of General Gage. He could feel the god's presence, a vast and sorrowful weight on his soul. But he could also see the tactical problem with the cold logic of a human general. The sanctum was not in real space. It was an ephemeral realm, anchored to this point, but not truly a part of it. A ship could not simply fly into it. It would be like trying to sail a boat into a dream. His shaper oracles chittered and swayed in their trances, their visions filled with images of impossible geometries and endless silent corridors. "The way is not open," one of them hissed, foam flecking its beak. "The skin of the world is too strong, we cannot enter. We can only smell the feast within. Then we will flay the skin," Prok declared, his voice a low growl of absolute certainty. He turned to the tactical hololith, which now displayed the full disposition of his remaining fleet. The Great Hunt had been costly. Of the uncountable trillions that had begun the journey, only a fraction remained. A few thousand war spheres, crewed by the strongest, most ruthless warriors, the true believers. They were not enough to fight a galactic war, but they were more than enough for what he had planned. Prok's mind, a fusion of predatory instinct and human strategy, conceived a plan of such colossal, self-destructive audacity that no sane commander would ever have considered it. It was a desperate gambit, a suicide mission on the scale of an entire fleet. He would not try to subtly part the veil. He would use the raw, kinetic force of his own armada to punch a hole through it. He would use his living ships as a battering ram to smash his way into a god's nursery. The command went out, not as an order to be debated, but as a psychic compulsion, a final, undeniable surge of the Master Shaper's will. The fleet began to move, forming not a battle line, but a spear. At the very tip of this spear were the smallest, fastest vessels, the hollowed-out asteroid ships and scout spheres. Behind them came the larger war spheres, and at the rear, the most massive, ancient vessels, including Prok's own flagship. They were arranging themselves into a cosmic projectile, a bullet made of ships and living bodies. On the lesser vessels at the tip of the spear, the Kroot warriors knew what was about to happen. There was no fear, there was no dissent. They had been culled, tested, and found worthy. They were the vanguard, the tip of the claw. To be the first to strike the god's sanctum, even in death, was the greatest honor imaginable. They chanted, not in prayer, but in a low, rhythmic growl of anticipation, the sound of a predator about to leap. "All vessels, full power to the engines," Prok commanded, his voice resonating through the fleet. "We will accelerate as one. We will become a single will, a single talon. The vessels at the tip will be our sacrifice. Their impact will create the wound. The vessels behind will widen it. We, at the heart of the spear, will pass through the opening into the sanctum. The engines of 1,000 war spheres ignited, their strange biological drives pulsing with a sickly green light. The entire fleet began to move, accelerating towards the shimmering distortion at the heart of the anathema maw. It was a slow, ponderous movement at first, but it gathered speed, the fleet compressing into a single, unified lance of destruction. Skralk, now a conscripted warrior aboard the Iron Quill Warsphere, Carrion Feast, stood shoulder to shoulder with his new, temporary kin. He felt the ship shudder as its engines pushed it to its limits. He looked out of a viewport at the insane spectacle. He saw the smaller ships ahead, their hulls already beginning to glow with heat and friction against an unseen barrier. They were the expendable. He was somewhere in the middle of the spear, part of the blade. His chances of survival were minimal. The old Kroot instinct, the will to survive, to evolve, to endure, warred with the psychic compulsion of the Great Hunt. But the hunt was stronger. He found himself gripping his rifle, his beak parted in a silent snarl, his mind focused only on the target. He was a weapon, and he was being fired. As the fleet neared its target, the fabric of reality began to protest. Strange, non-Euclidean shapes flickered at the edges of their vision. The silent void was filled with the psychic whispers of the dreaming god, a lullaby of sorrow that threatened to lull the unwilled into a catatonic sleep. But the Kroot's fanaticism was a shield against this. Their minds were too full of hunger to have room for despair. The first ships hit. There was no explosion of fire and metal. There was a sickening, tearing sound, a noise that was both physical and psychic. The scout spheres and asteroid ships simply ceased to exist. They struck the veil and were unmade. Their matter and energy converted into a brief, violent flash of shimmering violet light. But they had done their work. A tiny hairline fracture appeared in the shimmering sphere of the sanctum. The next wave of ships struck, widening the crack. More war spheres were annihilated. Their living crews turned into bursts of raw, screaming ether. The fracture became a tear. Then the main body of the fleet hit, a sustained, thunderous impact of hundreds of vessels sacrificing themselves against the wound. The tear became a hole. A bleeding, raw-edged tunnel that led from the cold, dead reality of the anathema maw into the impossible psychic landscape of the god's sanctum. It was a wound in the skin of the universe, and it was held open only by the continuous suicidal pressure of the Kroot fleet. Forward! Proc roared as the Grave Eater plunged into the tunnel. The ship screamed as the energies of the Immaterium tore at its organic hull. View screens showed not stars, but swirling vortexes of pure emotion, landscapes of sorrow, and mountains of silent regret. They were through. Proc and his chosen apex kindred, the heart of the Great Hunt, had breached the walls of heaven. Behind them, the tunnel was already beginning to collapse, sealing itself shut as the last of the battering ram ships were consumed. It was a one-way trip. There would be no retreat. The final hunt had reached its sacred ground. The inside of the nascent god's sanctum was a violation of sanity. It was not a place of physical dimensions, but a living, emotional landscape. The Kroot warriors of the Apex Kindred, spilling from the wreckage of the vessels that had survived the passage, found themselves standing on a shore of crystallized sorrow that crumbled like glass beneath their feet. Above them, the sky was a swirling aurora of melancholic purples and deep, listless blues. Great, weeping formations of psychic energy that resembled willows made of tears drifted through the air. The very atmosphere was thick, with a palpable sense of loss, a gentle, mournful pressure that sought to crush the spirit. Angkor Prok was the first to emerge from the scarred hull of the Grave Eater. The stolen mind of General Gage recoiled from the sheer unreality of the place, but the Kroot Shaper's soul thrilled to it. This was the god's lair, the heart of the prey. He took a deep breath, and the air tasted of ancient regret and beautiful, tragic endings. It was the most exquisite thing he had ever known. His warriors, the strongest of his species, fanned out around him, their senses overwhelmed, but their purpose unwavering. They were an island of violent, predatory intent in an ocean of absolute peace. In the center of this impossible realm, the god was taking form. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a titan of shimmering and tropic light. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but impossibly vast, a seated figure whose head was lost in the swirling colors of the sky. Its face was a mask of serene, heartbreaking sadness. It did not seem to notice the intruders. Its attention was turned inward, contemplating the perfect, silent stillness of its own being. This was the god of quiescence, the final meal. Behold, the culmination! Proc shrieked, his voice cutting through the profound silence. The final shape! The source of our apotheosis! We will feast on its heart and know the peace of the void! His warriors roared in answer, a hungry, guttural sound that was a blasphemy in this quiet place. They raised their weapons and began to advance across the crystal shore towards the seated god, a tide of green hunger preparing to devour a mountain of light. But they were not alone. From the shadows of a weeping crystal mesa, a new figure emerged. Dark Apostle Malcor Vran, his crimson armor a bloody stain on the ethereal landscape, strode forward, his own chosen retinue of Terminators, the Anointed, marching at his side. He had not needed a battering ram of ships. His sorcerers had sung a single, perfect blasphemous note that had parted the veil just long enough for them to step through. Primitive beasts. Vivran's voice boomed, amplified by the warp-infused daemons bound to his Crozius Arcanum. You come to this sacred ground as a dog comes to a feast, with drool on its lips and no understanding in its eyes. This is a place of worship, not a feeding trough. Proc turned, his black eyes fixing on the Dark Apostle. The human general's mind within him instantly assessed the threat. 10 heavily armored warriors led by a formidable command unit. A minor obstacle. The chattering ape speaks of things he does not comprehend, Proc rasped. This divinity is not to be worshipped, it is to be consumed. It is a stepping stone for a greater destiny. Stand aside or be trampled. Your destiny is to be fodder for a truth you are too ignorant to grasp. Vran retorted, raising his accursed Crozius. In the name of Lorgar Aurelian, and in the service of this new silent lord, you shall be purged. The anointed Terminators charged, their storm bolters roaring, spitting explosive shells that detonated against the charging Kroot. The apex kindred warriors were torn apart, their bodies exploding in sprays of green blood and viscera. But for every Kroot that fell, 10 more surged forward, leaping over the bodies of their kin, their sharpened blades and beaks ready to tear into ceramite. The two small armies clashed in a brutal melee at the foot of a god. Proc and Vran ignored the lesser battle, their gazes locked on each other. They were the two high priests of opposing faiths, and this was their holy ground. They charged, meeting in a shower of sparks and psychic energy. Proc was a blur of natural speed, his fossilized arm blades a whirlwind of strikes. Vran was a bastion of unnatural power, his Terminator armor deflecting the blows as he swung his Crozius in a ponderous, crushing arc. The weapon crackled with dark energy, and with every near miss, it left a sizzling trail of corrupted reality in the air. As the two leaders fought their personal duel, a third power entered the arena, a brilliant flash of white light, and Commander Shadowsun, flanked by the 6 surviving members of her XV Parshibuk Coldstar battlesuit bodyguard, descended from the swirling sky on columns of pure energy. Using the intelligence from the Greyshade kindred, her Earth-case scientists had devised a one-shot phase inverter that could punch a temporary hole through the veil, just large enough for a single strike team. By the Tova, this madness ends now, she declared, her voice a calm, commanding presence in the chaos. The Cold Star suits opened fire, not with the indiscriminate fury of the word-bearers, but with the focused, overwhelming firepower of the Teal. Fusion blasters and plasma rifles unleashed pinpoint blasts of incandescent energy, vaporizing Kroot and Chaos Marine alike. Shadowsun's target was the god itself. Her mission was not to defeat the Kroot or the forces of chaos, but to avert the catastrophe of the god's consumption or worship. She saw its passive, sorrowful form and made a calculated decision. A being of pure psychic energy might be dispersed by a sufficient shock to its matrix. All units target the entity, full power, fire until your reactors are dry, she commanded. The battlesuits unleashed their payload. Missiles streaked across. The non-space, fusion beams of pure solar heat lanced out, and great gouts of plasma struck the seated god. The entity of light did not cry out. It did not fight back. It simply flinched. The light of its form dimmed, its ethereal body shuddering under the onslaught. The entire landscape trembled in sympathy, the crystal ground cracking, the weeping willows of energy dissolving. Proc saw this. He saw the Tau trying to destroy his prize, to deny him his destiny. With a furious shriek, he disengaged from Vran. The duel for faith could wait. The fight for the feast was now. He bounded away from the Dark Apostle with inhuman speed, ignoring the plasma bolt searing past him, his eyes fixed on the heart of the shuddering god. Vran also saw his potential deity being harmed. Blasphemers! He roared, turning his attention from the Kroot. You strike at perfection with your crude trinkets. You will die for this insult. He and his anointed ignored the Kroot and turned their fire on Shadowsun's position. The three-way battle for the fate of a god had begun. The Kroot, driven by hunger, tried to reach the god's heart. The word-bearers, driven by faith, tried to protect the god by annihilating the Tau. And the Tau, driven by reason, tried to destroy the god to save the galaxy. It was a perfect, deadly triangle of opposing goals, a microcosm of the galactic war itself, fought in the unreal throne room of a silent, weeping divinity. Shadowsun's logic, Proc's hunger, and Vran's faith clashed in a final, apocalyptic confrontation, while the prize they all fought over simply sat and watched, its form flickering, its silent sorrow growing with every new act of violence committed in its name. The chaotic three-way battle raged, a whirlwind of conflicting energies at the feet of a dying god. Shadowsun, a master of the Kauyon, used the ethereal landscape to her advantage. Her Cold Star bodyguard team executed perfect jump-shoot-jump maneuvers, using the weeping crystal formations as cover, their fusion blasters methodically dismantling Vran's Terminator retinue. One of the anointed was caught in a crossfire, his ancient armor melting into slag around his screaming form. Another was blasted from his feet and fell into a chasm of pure despair that opened in the crystal ground, his soul dissolving before his body hit the bottom. Malkor Vran, incensed, fought with the fury of a zealot whose idol was being desecrated. He ignored the Kroot, focusing his entire being on the Tau commander. He charged Shadowsun, his accursed Crozius held high, chanting litanies that caused the very air to curdle. Shadowsun met his charge not with strength, but with speed and technology. Her battlesuit's thrusters flared, launching her backwards as she unloaded both her fusion blasters at point-blank range into the Dark Apostle. The blast struck his demonic ward, a shimmering shield of invisible force, and exploded with the light of a small sun. The shield held, but it flickered, and Vran was staggered by the sheer kinetic force. It was the opening Angkor Prok had been waiting for. The duel between the forces of order and chaos was a distraction, a squabble between two lesser predators over a carcass. While Vran was focused on Shadowsun, the Master Shaper moved. He was no longer a general or a warrior. He was a force of pure primal hunger. He ignored the plasma fire, the bolt shells, the dying screams of his own kindred. His path was a straight, unwavering line to the heart of the wounded god. He leapt, his powerful legs propelling him in a great arc that carried him over the heads of the battling warriors. He landed on the knee of the seated god, his talons sinking into the packed, the being's form of cohesive light. The substance of the god felt like cold, dense sorrow. It did not burn or shock, it simply absorbed his physical being, drawing him in. For a moment, he faltered, the sheer weight of the entity's passive despair threatening to extinguish his own fiery purpose. But the hunger of 1,000,000,000,000 Kroot souls, the driving imperative of the Great Hunt, burned brighter. With a final, triumphant shriek that echoed across the sanctum, he drove his fossilized arm blades deep into the god's chest, into the core of its being where its light was the brightest. A scream. It was not a sound. It was a psychic event that dwarfed everything that had come before it. It was the death cry of a divine being, a shockwave of pure, final despair that erupted from the anathema maw and washed over the entire galaxy in an instant. On 1,000 worlds, psychers clutched their heads and died, their minds shattered by a sorrow too vast to comprehend. Navigators on the bridge of their ships went permanently blind, their third eyes burned out by a vision of absolute dissolution. Trillions of sentient beings across the stars felt a sudden, inexplicable moment of profound loss, a fleeting sadness for a death they could not name. In the sanctum, the effect was apocalyptic. The seated god of light imploded, collapsing in on the point where Proc had struck it. The entire landscape of sorrow convulsed and then dissolved into a roaring violet vortex of annihilating energy. Malkor Vran, his concentration broken by the psychic scream, looked up in horror as his nascent god died. The last of his anointed were torn apart by the vortex, their souls stripped from their bodies and unmade. Viren himself was caught in the blast. His demonic ward shattered, his blessed armor cracked, and he was thrown, broken and dying, back through the tearing veil into the cold reality of the dead star system. Shadowsun's battlesuit alarms shrieked as the reality bubble collapsed. "Eject! Phase out now!" she yelled to her surviving pilots. 3 of the Cold Stars managed to activate their phase inverters, their forms dissolving into light just as the wave of annihilation hit. The other 2 were not so fortunate. They and their pilots were simply erased from existence, their matter and energy consumed by the god's death throes. Shadowsun felt a lurch as her own suit phased out, the last thing she saw being the triumphant, terrible silhouette of Angkor Prok, standing at the heart of the storm, drinking deep from the raw essence of a dead god. The apotheosis was not a gentle transformation. It was a violation of biology, physics, and spirit. As the divine energy of quiescence flooded into Angkor Prok, it also flooded out, through him, into every Kroot connected to the psychic gestalt of the Great Hunt. For the trillions of Kroot across the fleet, the moment was one of both ecstasy and agony. The energy was too pure, too potent for their mortal forms. On the bridge of the Grave Eater, Prok's apex kindred screamed as the transformation took them. Some simply dissolved into shimmering, purple dust, their bodies unable to contain the divine power. Others mutated horribly, their flesh twisting into shrieking, mindless abominations of bone and sorrow, things that were no longer Kroot but were now echoes of the god's pain. They turned on each other, a brief, mad frenzy of cannibalistic horror before they too collapsed into nothingness. Angkor Prok himself underwent the most profound change. His gnarled body convulsed, his bones snapping and reforming. His hide became smooth, iridescent, shifting in color from green to the deep violet of the void. The stolen intellect of General Gage was burned away, a triviality consumed by a far greater consciousness. The hunger that had defined him, that had defined his entire species, was gone. In its place was a vast, cold, and utterly serene emptiness. He had feasted, and now, for the first time in his existence, he was full. The great hunt was over. The singular purpose that had united a species was achieved. The victory was absolute. They had hunted a god, and they had won. But the cost was catastrophic. Of the trillions that had set out from the Tau Empire and 1,000 other worlds, less than 1 billion survived the apotheosis. The Kroot as a species had been decimated, their numbers reduced by more than 99%. But those who remained were no longer just Kroot. They were something new, something terrible. They were the Kroot Ascendant, each one a demigod infused with the quiet, final power of a murdered god of silence. The Pyrrhic victory was complete. They had sacrificed their past, their present, and their very nature for a terrifying new future. The immediate aftermath of the divine death scream was a cacophony of shattered fleets and broken minds. The Anathema Maw, once a place of tense, converging purpose, became a scrapyard of galactic ambitions. Reality reasserted itself with the brutal finality of a slammed door, and the fleets that had gathered there found themselves crippled, leaderless, and reeling in the psychic void left by the god's demise. The Wordbearers' armada suffered the most grievous blow. Their connection to the warp, the very source of their power and faith, felt thin and frayed in the absolute psychic silence the dead god had left behind. The daemons bound into their ships' hulls withered and shrieked, some fading from existence entirely. Sorcerers found their powers sputtering and failing, their profane whispers answered by an unnerving emptiness. On the bridge of the Lectitio Divinitatis, the survivors found the broken form of Dark Apostle Malcor Vran hurled back from the collapsing sanctum. He was alive, but his mind was gone, his eyes staring into a distance only he could see, endlessly muttering a single horrified word: silence. The fleet, its spiritual leader lobotomized and its divine purpose annihilated, lost all cohesion. The surviving captains, proud and arrogant servants of chaos, fell to infighting, each blaming the other for the catastrophic failure. The great pilgrimage of the Wordbearers devolved into a scattered internecine war, a pack of wolves turning on each other now that their prey was gone. Aboard the TO command vessel, the Stalwart Shield, Commander Shadowsun rematerialized with her 3 surviving bodyguards. The bridge was a scene of controlled chaos. The psychic shockwave had overloaded every system not hardened against it. Consoles sparked and smoked, and several Earth-cased engineers lay unconscious at their posts. But the TO, shielded by their rational minds and lack of psychic sensitivity, had weathered the storm better than the others. Shadowsun, however, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the damage to her ship. She had witnessed the apotheosis. She had seen what the Kroot had become. "Status report," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. An officer, her face pale, brought up the long-range sensor logs. The image that coalesced on the main screen was horrifying. The vast, chaotic Kroot armada was gone. In its place was a much smaller, eerily ordered fleet. The war spheres had changed. Their mottled organic hulls now shimmered with a faint, violet luminescence. They moved with a silent, preternatural grace, their formations perfect, their movements synchronized to an impossible degree. The ravenous, chittering horde was now a silent, disciplined force. Worse still was the sensor data, where once there had been trillions of individual Kroot life signs, there were now only a few 100 million. But each of those signs was wrong. They radiated a subtle, dampening field, a personal bubble of the same psychic nullity that now defined the entire system. "What are they doing?" Shadowsun whispered. "They are consolidating, Commander," the officer replied, her voice trembling. "They are gathering the wreckage of their own destroyed ships, but they are not salvaging. They appear to be reshaping it, with no visible tools or energy emissions." On the view screen, they watched as the new Kroot, the Ascendant, moved through the debris field. One of them would touch the shattered husk of a war sphere, and the organic matter would flow like clay, twisting and reforming into a newer, sleeker, more sinister shape under its silent command. The Kroot were not just transformed, they were now masters of a subtle form of reality warping, reshaping matter with the force of their new, divine will. The front that had been defined by three converging fleets had shattered into disparate, broken pieces. The Imperium's crusade fleet Metis, hundreds of light years away, was only just beginning to stir from its psychic stupor. The collective will of the Black Templars and their fanatical commissars was slowly reasserting control, but the fleet was in disarray, its momentum lost, its purpose now unclear. The threat they had been sent to fight had fundamentally changed. Shadowsun knew she could not fight what the Kroot had become. Her small reclamation fleet was a scalpel, and what was needed now was a planet killer. Her mission had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. Her allies had not been reclaimed. They had metamorphosed into something far more dangerous than she could have ever conceived. "Recall all scout drones," she ordered, her voice heavy with the weight of her failure. "Send our complete findings to the Ethereal Council. All data, the transformation, the new abilities, everything. Code it Nemesis Omega. Recommend immediate fortification of the border sectors and the abandonment of all shared worlds. Our alliance with the Kroot is over. Our war with the Ascendancy has just begun." She cast one last look at the silent, glowing Kroot fleet as it calmly and terrifyingly rebuilt itself from its own ashes. "Helm, plot a course back to Tau. Take us home." The Tau fleet turned, a small, battered remnant of reason fleeing from a place where reason had died. The shattered Wordbearer's fleet tore itself apart in a civil war of bitter recriminations. The Imperial Crusade was a sleeping giant, slowly, groggily waking to a battle that was already over. The front had not just been broken, it had been erased, replaced by a new and terrible reality. The Great Hunt had ended, and in the deafening silence of its conclusion, the survivors could only flee, leaving the newborn Kroot ascendancy to its silent, monstrous genesis in the graveyard of its own god. A vacuum abhors nature, and in the immaterium, a place where nature itself is a twisted parody, a vacuum of emotion is a blasphemous anomaly. The death of the nascent god of quiescence and the subsequent apotheosis of the Kroot ascendant did not just leave a hole in the material plane. It carved a perfectly silent, spherical wound in the fabric of the warp itself. This new silent zone, centered on the anathema maw, was an area of absolute psychic nullity, larger than any Necron pylon could ever hope to generate. It was a dead space, an emotional black hole that did not rage or storm, but simply was not. This profound stillness, this utter absence of the background psychic noise that permeated the galaxy, acted as a beacon for beings that existed on a scale far beyond the comprehension of mortals. It was a sudden, jarring silence in the middle of a never-ending song, and two vastly different powers turned their ancient attentions towards it. Far out in the intergalactic void, a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan, a colossal biofleet consisting of tens of thousands of vessels, was making its inexorable way towards the galactic plane. To the hive mind, the galaxy was a cacophony of psychic energy, a chaotic buffet of emotions, thoughts, and souls that it intended to consume and silence. The birth of the god of quiescence had been but one loud, sorrowful voice in this chorus. Its death, however, was something new. The sudden creation of the silent zone was, to the hive mind's perception, like a chunk of its anticipated meal suddenly vanishing from the plate. It was a denial of sustenance, an inexplicable removal of biomass from the cosmic equation. The central consciousness of the Hive fleet, a being of unimaginable scale and intelligence, paused in its advance. It processed the phenomenon not with curiosity, but with a cold, predatory logic. Life is noise. Silence is death. A region of the galaxy had died without it being eaten. This was a contradiction, a threat, an inefficiency that could not be tolerated. Without hesitation, the hive mind issued a new, overriding directive to the vanguard organisms of the tendril. The original invasion corridor was abandoned. A new course was set. The great chitinous leviathans of the Terranid fleet turned as one, a river of biological hunger diverting its flow towards the source of the unnatural silence. They were not coming to investigate a mystery. They were coming to correct an error, to reclaim the biomass that had been denied to them, and to silence the silence in the only way they knew how. By consuming it, a new war was coming, not of faith or reason, but of competing, absolute hungers. At the same time, in the cold, silent heart of the galaxy, a throne of living metal stirred. Sarek, the last of the Silent Kings, sat upon his days of dominion, his necrodermis form unmoving, but his mind, a matrix of cold, perfect logic, processing the data that flowed in from his empire's most sensitive detection networks. The Necrons had been the first to feel the effects of the Pariah Nexus, the grand experiment that had inadvertently provided the psychic trauma for the god's birth. Now, they were the first to understand the true nature of its aftermath. The Silent King's interest was not in the death of a minor warp entity. Such fleeting emotional things were beneath his contempt. His interest was in the silence itself. For millennia, the Necrons' grand plan had been the severing of the material universe from the torment of the warp, the imposition of a final, logical order upon a chaotic reality. The Great Rift had been a catastrophic setback to this goal. But the Silent Zone? This was something else. It was a naturally occurring, stable, and expanding region of absolute nullity. It was a proof of concept, a working model of the very thing he sought to achieve. Analyze the phenomenon, his command, transmitted as a beam of pure information, echoed through the tomb complexes of a dozen core worlds. Ascertain the cause of its genesis, determine its stability, calculate the potential for replication. Reports flowed back to him from his cryptex and techno-sorcerers. They spoke of a Xenos species, the Kroot, and a bizarre act of deicide. They detailed the species' subsequent transformation into beings who seemed to carry a piece of this null field within their very soul. To the Necrons, this was a development of supreme importance. The Kroot Ascendant were not just an anomaly, they were a potential tool, or a terrifying new rival. They were biological creatures who had somehow achieved a state of being that mirrored the Necrons' own desired endgame. They were an affront to the Necron monopoly on soullessness, a living parody of their great work. Sarek, the strategist who played games across eons, saw the board shifting. The Silent Zone could be a weapon of unimaginable power, a shield against the horrors of the warp. But the beings who controlled it, the Kroot Ascendant, were an unknown variable. They were biological, and therefore unpredictable, illogical, and flawed. Their control over this power could not be permitted. A new directive was issued from the days of Dominion. A reclamation legion, composed of the most ancient and powerful Necron dynasties, was awakened from its slumber. Their tomb worlds, silent for 60 million years, blazed with green light as legions of immortal, metallic warriors marched from their crypts. Their great Cairn-class tomb ships and Scythe-class harvest ships rose from the dust of dead planets, their drive silent, their purpose absolute. They were not being sent to conquer or to destroy. They were being sent to acquire, to study, to dissect the Kroot Ascendant and learn the secret of their transformation. And if study proved impossible, they were to sterilize the entire region, erasing this biological perversion of their grand design from existence. The whispers of a new war had begun. The death of a forgotten god and the birth of the Kroot Ascendancy had acted as a stone dropped into a cosmic pond. The ripples were now reaching the shores of the galaxy's oldest and most implacable powers. The Tyranids, driven by a biological imperative, and the Necrons, driven by a logical one, were now converging on the same blighted patch of space. The Silent Zone was no longer a legacy of a finished war, but the epicenter of a new, far more terrible conflict, one that would be fought not over souls or faith, but over the fundamental nature of existence itself. In the aftermath of their violent birth, the Kroot Ascendant did not celebrate, nor did they mourn. The turbulent emotions that had once defined their species, the thrill of the hunt, the fear of starvation, the loyalty to kindred, had been scoured from their souls, replaced by the profound, cold stillness of their consumed god. They were now beings of pure, serene purpose. Their first act was not one of conquest, but of consolidation, a silent, methodical creation of a new home worthy of their new nature. The anathema maw and the surrounding systems, ravaged by the passage of the Great Hunt and the subsequent battles, became their clay. Angkor Prok, now a being of shimmering, violet-hued flesh who styled himself only as the First Ascendant, stood upon the bridge of his reshaped war sphere and directed the great work. He no longer issued commands with voice or gesture. His will simply emanated outwards, a silent, irresistible directive that his people obeyed without question or hesitation. They were no longer a collection of individuals, but a true Gestalt consciousness, a unified entity with a billion bodies. Their first project was the cleansing of their own dead, the wreckage of the Kroot vessels used in the desperate gambit, and the billions of bodies of those who had not survived the apotheosis were not left to float in the void. The Ascendant gathered them, and with their newfound mastery over biological matter, they began a process of divine recycling. Husks of war spheres were melted down, not with heat, but with a focused application of will, their organic structures unraveling and then reweaving into new, more perfect forms. The new Kroot ships were things of stark, terrifying beauty. They were sleek, obsidian structures that seemed to absorb light, resembling sharpened shards of volcanic glass more than living vessels. The chaotic, overgrown aesthetic of the old Kroot was gone, replaced by a design of minimalist, predatory perfection. The dead bodies of their kin were not consumed for sustenance. Instead, they were rendered down into a shimmering protoplasmic sludge. This divine slurry was then transported to the dead worlds within the Silent Zone, planets like Voltarn that had been scoured clean of all life. On these barren rocks, the Ascendant began to sculpt. They poured the biological medium onto the dead soil, and under their gentle, silent guidance, new life began to take root. It was not a life that the galaxy had ever seen before. There were no chaotic jungles or teeming plains. Instead, vast crystalline forests of purple and black grew in perfect geometric patterns. Rivers of a mercury-like substance flowed in precise angular courses. The fauna that emerged were creatures of silent grace and terrible efficiency, beings designed not for a vibrant ecosystem, but for the stark, quiet beauty of the Ascendancy's new philosophy. The Kroot were not building cities. They were reshaping entire planets into living nests, vast territorial markers that pulsed with the same null energy as their masters. They were creating an empire of silence, a buffer zone against the noisy, chaotic galaxy they had left behind. Pockets of resistance from the shattered Wordbearers fleet were dealt with not as a military threat, but as an impurity to be cleansed. A traitor strike cruiser, its crew driven mad by the psychic void, attempted to raid one of the gestating nest worlds. It was met not by a fleet, but by a single Kroot Ascendant. The warrior, whose name had been Skralk, simply flew through the void under his own power and landed silently on the ship's hull. He did not cut his way in. He placed his hand on the ceramite, and the metal flowed like water around it, creating a seamless opening. Inside, he did not fight the traitor Marines. He simply walked through the corridors, and in his wake, the fires of faith and hatred in the hearts of the Chaos worshippers were extinguished. They fell to their knees, their minds emptied, their souls becalmed, becoming little more than catatonic statues in their own profane temples. The Ascendant did not kill them. It simply erased their reason for being. The ship, now crewed by silent, mindless slaves, was guided into the nearest star. The Ascendant's consolidation was an act of profound and terrifying creation. They were not merely conquering territory. They were unmaking it and remaking it in their own image. They were imposing a new form of order, a philosophy of perfect predatory stillness upon a canvas of dead system. Any remaining outposts, be they Imperial, Xenos, or Heretic, within the expanding Silent Zone, were not destroyed in fire, but were simply quieted. Their inhabitants were either assimilated into the mindless workforce that tended the crystalline forests, or were methodically dismantled, their biomass added to the great recycling. The first Ascendant, Angkor Prok, oversaw it all from his throne on the newly christened throne world of stillness, the remade Voltarn. The hunger that had driven him across the galaxy was gone, but a new, more subtle appetite had taken its place. It was no longer a hunger for flesh or strength. It was a hunger for silence. The chaotic, screaming galaxy beyond his perfect, quiet empire was an offense, a discordant note in a symphony that should be utterly serene. His new purpose, the purpose of all Kroot Ascendant, was clear. They would not conquer the galaxy. They would pacify it. They would extend their silent dominion, star by star, until all the pointless, passionate noise of life was finally, mercifully extinguished. The scouring of their own territory was complete. Now, the great work of consolidating the rest of the universe could begin. The Great Hunt was over. A story that had begun with the collective shriek of a species embarking on a galactic migration had ended in a profound and spreading silence. This silence became the hunt's true legacy, a permanent and cancerous wound upon the map of the galaxy. Astrogators and navigators learned to fear this new region, a patch of absolute black, where the light of the Astronomicon did not merely dim, but bent and broke, as if fleeing from the utter void within. They named it the Zona Quietus, the Silent Zone, and like the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom, it became a border beyond which sane men did not travel. The Imperium, that monolithic beast of bureaucracy and war, reacted with the only tool it truly possessed: brute force and quarantine. Crusade Fleet Metis, finally shaken from its psychic stupor, arrived weeks late to a battle that had already been lost and won. They found no ravenous horde to purge, only a handful of silent, shimmering Kroot vessels guarding the borders of their new domain. The Black Templars, eager for a righteous slaughter, were met with an enemy that would not fight, but simply erased their will to do so. Ships that ventured too deep into the Silent Zone would cease communications, their crews falling into a dreamless, catatonic peace from which they would never wake, leaving their vessels to drift aimlessly until their reactors died. Inquisitor Lord Xanthus stood before the High Lords of Terra once more. The hollow pit now showed the Silent Zone not as a moving stain, but as a permanent, festering wound. "I was wrong," Xanthus stated, his whispered voice carrying more weight than any shouted proclamation. "I compared this threat to the beast. The beast was a war of fang and claw, a thing we could meet with bolt gun and blade. This is a spiritual contagion, a war for the soul of the galaxy itself. The Kroot Ascendant do not seek to conquer us. They seek to cure us. They see our passions, our faith, our rage, and our hope as a disease. Their goal is to pacify the galaxy, to bring the peace of the grave to all living things." A new edict was issued. The Zona Quietus was declared purgatus, forbidden to all Imperial travel. A cordon impenetrable, a line of fortress worlds and navy patrol groups, was established along its entire border, a task that would drain the resources of 3 sectors for centuries to come. The Imperium was not fighting a war of extermination against the Kroot Ascendancy. It was fighting a war of containment against an idea, against the seductive, terrifying promise of silence. For the Tau Empire, the legacy of the Great Hunt was a scar that would never heal. The sudden, absolute loss of their most numerous and versatile auxiliary species had crippled their military might and shattered their expansionist doctrines. Commander Shadowsun's report, classified at the highest levels, sent a shockwave of cold, pragmatic fear through the Ethereal Council. Their philosophy of the greater good, of a voluntary and enlightened coalition of species, was proven tragically naive. The Kroot had not been partners, they had been sleeping predators, and the Tiao had merely been a convenient stop on their evolutionary path. A new, more cynical age began for the Tiao. They turned inward, fortifying their borders, investing heavily in drone armies to replace the flesh they had lost. They stopped building bridges to new species and began building walls. The optimism that had been their greatest strength was now tempered by the bitter memory of betrayal. And what of the Kroot themselves? They were Kroot no longer. Not in spirit. The Ascendancy, under the silent rule of the First Ascendant, had achieved their ultimate goal, but in doing so, had annihilated the very culture they had sought to elevate. There were no more kindreds, no more shapers, no more of the vibrant, savage society that had endured for millions of years. There was only the serene, unified will of the Ascendant. They had become perfect predators, but they no longer hunted for strength or survival. The legends they began to whisper to each other in their silent, unified mind were not of great beasts they had consumed, but of concepts they would one day absorb. They spoke of the day they would hunt the concept of rage from the followers of Khorne, leaving them placid and helpless. They spoke of consuming the idea of hope from the beleaguered defenders of the Imperium, leaving them in perfect, logical despair. Their final hunt, the ultimate apotheosis, would be to find the heart of the tyrannid hive mind and devour its singular, overriding hunger, bringing the great devourer itself to a final, permanent stillness. The legacy of the Great Hunt was ash. For the galaxy, it was the ash of trillions of lives, of dead worlds and shattered fleets. For the Tau, it was the ash of a broken alliance and a lost future. For the Kroot themselves, it was the ash of their own identity, sacrificed on the altar of a terrible, silent god. A new galactic power had been born, not of fire and fury, but of a chilling, profound emptiness. The Silent Zone was now the most contested region of space, a battleground for cosmic horrors as the tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan began their assault on its borders, met not by weapons, but by waves of null energy, while the silent legions of the Necrons made their own methodical advance, seeking the secrets of the living silence. The Great Hunt was over. The Great Pacification had begun.